No one expected that a war, which had already become routine in its cruelty, would take such a deceptive turn. By the end of 1944, the Allied forces were advancing steadily through France and Belgium toward the German border. Autumn had given way to a harsh winter. The front stretched for hundreds of miles, and most soldiers believed the end was near. The armies were exhausted, the machines worn down, and morale survived only on the hope that the nightmare would soon be over. But beneath the calm surface of the front, one of the most audacious operations of the war was taking shape. Hitler needed a shock, a final blow that could disrupt the Allied momentum. From this desperation came a plan under the command of the famed commando leader Otto Skorzeny. The operation was called Panzer Brigade 150, and its mission broke every conventional rule of warfare. Infiltrate Allied lines disguised as American soldiers. Preparations were secret and intense. German officers scoured their ranks for men who could speak English, sailors, pilots, translators, students, anyone who could form a sentence without a heavy accent. They were issued authentic-looking U.S. uniforms, helmets, M1 rifles, captured jeeps, even packs of Lucky Strike cigarettes. Every detail had to be perfect, convincing enough to fool an Allied officer face to face. The goal of Operation Greif was not open combat, but confusion. The disguised commandos were to infiltrate Allied territory, change road signs, spread false orders, redirect traffic, sabotage bridges, and sow distrust. The plan relied entirely on deception. If the enemy could be made to doubt his own eyes, the advance would falter, and perhaps the German counteroffensive in the Ardennes would gain the time it needed. When the Great Ardennes Offensive began in December 1944, Hitler's last gamble on the Western Front, these men moved forward alongside the tanks. Wearing American stars on their helmets, they crossed bridges, passed through checkpoints, and blended seamlessly among Allied convoys. They spoke the right slang, carried American maps, and nodded confidently to unsuspecting sentries. For a time, no one knew the difference. Then, strange reports began to emerge. Radio messages contained errors in phrasing. Road signs suddenly pointed the wrong way, and entire supply convoys vanished after taking false directions. Some officers received contradictory orders that no one could trace. Confusion spread faster than any German division could move. In the chaos, it became clear that the enemy was already among them, wearing their uniforms, speaking their language. The brilliance of the plan lay in its simplicity. The German commandos had studied American habits down to the smallest detail. How soldiers carried their rifles, how they held cigarettes, even how they chewed gum. They imitated the slang, the posture, and the relaxed manner of U.S. troops on the march. Their deception was so convincing that even captured American vehicles could pass through frontline checkpoints unnoticed. Yet the danger of such a mission was absolute. Any mistake, a wrong baseball team, a mispronounced word, a misplaced salute could mean instant death. Within the first few days, several groups were exposed when they gave inconsistent answers to simple questions about U.S. culture. One man failed to recall the capital of a state. Another mentioned the wrong number of stripes on the flag. After that, paranoia spread through the ranks like wildfire. Soon, suspicion was everywhere. American patrols began interrogating anyone on the road, even their own officers. Soldiers were stopped and questioned about childhood trivia, Mickey Mouse, football teams, movie stars, anything to prove authenticity. Convoys slowed to a crawl, traffic backed up for miles, and tempers flared. The disguised commandos had already achieved their goal: chaos behind enemy lines. The stakes for the Germans were deadly. Disguising themselves as enemy soldiers made them spies under international law, stripped of all rights if captured. Execution was immediate and without trial. Otto Skorzeny knew this, but he accepted the risk. He believed the outcome could change the war. For his men, survival depended not on firepower, but on the perfection of their act. As the offensive raged on, the Ardennes became a maze of fear and mistrust. Snow-covered forests hid both armies. Fog blurred every distinction. The enemy could speak your language, wear your insignia, and walk among your own men. Fatigue, cold, and confusion turned every face into a potential threat. The front was no longer a clear line, it had dissolved into uncertainty. Reports described soldiers more afraid of mistakes than of bullets. They feared the eyes of those standing next to them, unsure whether they were friend or foe. Headquarters received conflicting messages, some claiming German saboteurs were everywhere, others dismissing the rumors as hysteria. But the damage had already been done. The Ardennes Offensive would become one of the most difficult and chaotic battles of the Western Front, and Operation Greif left its invisible mark on it. It was not a campaign of fire and steel, but of deception and psychology, a war fought within trust itself. That winter, soldiers learned that a uniform no longer guaranteed loyalty, and that the enemy could come smiling, speaking your language, and wearing your flag. It was a new kind of warfare, where the line between truth and illusion disappeared, and no one could be certain who stood beside them. By the morning of the 17th of December, 1944, the snow-covered Ardennes had turned into a labyrinth of suspicion. The German counteroffensive, launched in near silence under the cover of fog, had caught the Allies completely off guard. Tanks rumbled through the forests, cutting off roads and communications. But while the front burned, the real disruption began miles behind it among the columns of trucks, radio operators, and supply units that suddenly no longer trusted each other. The men of Panzer Brigade 150, disguised as Americans, slipped deep into this confusion. They drove captured jeeps, carried American rifles, and spoke just enough English to pass casual inspection. Their orders were to spread chaos, and they did it with precision. Road signs were turned, bridges mislabeled, fuel dumps misdirected. Some units claimed to have seen Americans suddenly pull out pistols and open fire before disappearing into the forest. Others reported strange patrols that vanished without trace. Each small act of sabotage rippled outward, slowing the Allied response to the German breakthrough. Convoys took wrong turns, reinforcements arrived late, and command posts lost contact with their divisions. The confusion was so complete that entire regiments hesitated to move without written verification of their orders. The battlefield had become a stage where uniforms meant nothing. In reality, the disguised German units were small, no more than a few dozen teams scattered among thousands of soldiers. But the rumor of them spread faster than the truth. Every checkpoint, every road, every familiar face was questioned. The Allies began to suspect treachery everywhere. The psychological effect far exceeded the physical damage. Soon, the Americans struck back with their own weapon control. Roadblocks appeared on every major route. Military police interrogated anyone traveling alone or in small groups. Soldiers were forced to answer questions that only true Americans would know. The names of baseball players, the capital of Vermont, the color of school buses. The questions were absurd, but effective. The enemy spoke English, yet not the language of everyday life. As the interrogations intensified, the disguised commandos began to falter. Their accents betrayed them. Their slang was off. Some carried the wrong kind of cigarettes, or wore boots tied differently from American fashion. A few even drove on the wrong side of the road. To a trained eye, the cracks were visible. Captured commandos confessed under questioning. They revealed that their mission was sabotage, not assassination, and that Otto Skorzeny himself commanded the operation. The news reached Allied high command quickly, but by then paranoia had taken on a life of its own. Rumors claimed the Germans planned to capture General Eisenhower in Paris. Security around Allied headquarters reached extremes. Roads closed, movements restricted, and guards doubled. The fear of infiltration did more to slow the Allied advance than the enemy itself. The real men of Operation Greif were trapped between two dangers: discovery by the Allies, or being mistaken for genuine Americans by their own side. In the chaos of the offensive, friendly fire was a constant risk. Some German units shot at them, unable to recognize their American uniforms. Others refused to cooperate, suspecting betrayal. The disguise that protected them also isolated them. Meanwhile, Allied patrols continued to uncover the truth piece by piece. The first captured commandos were executed as spies, in accordance with wartime law. Their fates sent a clear message. The deception had crossed into forbidden territory. Yet the damage to Allied morale could not be undone. Soldiers began turning their suspicion inward. Units delayed movements, radio messages were repeated endlessly for confirmation, and even senior officers faced interrogation at roadblocks. In the confusion, one American general was detained for hours because he gave the wrong answer about baseball. Another officer was nearly shot after forgetting the capital of Illinois. The war had become absurd logic, replaced by fear. Every conversation, every exchange of identification carried a shadow of doubt. As days passed, the effectiveness of Operation Greif began to fade. Many of the disguised Germans were captured or killed, their vehicles destroyed in the worsening winter conditions. Allied intelligence pieced together the extent of the deception and began warning troops across the front. Leaflets circulated describing how to identify imposters. The panic gradually turned into grim efficiency. But by then, the psychological wound had already been inflicted. Trust, the invisible fabric that held armies together, had been torn. Soldiers now second-guessed every order, every signal. Commanders hesitated to delegate authority. The enemy had not only infiltrated their lines, he had infiltrated their confidence. Even as the Battle of the Bulge reached its peak, reports of disguised saboteurs continued to circulate. Most were false, yet each one reignited the fear. In the frozen forests of Belgium, men saw threats in every uniform. The Germans had unleashed something far more dangerous than sabotage. They had weaponized uncertainty. In the end, Operation Greif did not achieve its strategic goal. The German offensive stalled, the supply lines collapsed, and the Allies recovered. But for a few weeks that winter, the front lines blurred into something deeper. A battlefield not of guns and tanks, but of perception. What Skorzeny's men accomplished was invisible on a map, but tangible in the minds of soldiers. They made every man question what he saw. They forced an army to look at itself and ask, "Who can I trust?" It was warfare reduced to its most human vulnerability, the loss of certainty. The deception was temporary, but its lesson endured. The enemy does not always approach with a different flag. Sometimes he looks exactly like you. When the smoke of the Ardennes began to fade in early January 1945, the frozen forests were littered with wreckage, twisted metal, and silence. The German counteroffensive had failed. The armored spearheads that once advanced confidently toward the Meuse now lay abandoned on snow-covered roads, surrounded by destroyed fuel trucks and lifeless trees. Operation Greif, conceived as the cutting edge of this desperate strike, had run its course. What remained was confusion, suspicion, and a record of one of the strangest episodes in modern warfare. The disguised commandos, who had survived the initial chaos, found themselves hunted not just by the enemy, but by time itself. Their mission had been born out of a dying regime's last attempt to alter destiny through deceit. By the final days of the operation, most of the German infiltrators were either captured or stranded behind enemy lines with no means of escape. Some tried to discard their American uniforms and rejoin their regular units, but the front had moved too fast. The few who managed to slip back into German territory brought with them stories of near misses, close interrogations, and a constant fear of discovery. For the Allies, the cleanup of the Ardennes meant more than clearing wreckage. It meant restoring trust within their own ranks. For weeks, the paranoia lingered. Military police continued to stop soldiers for questioning long after the last German saboteur had been caught. Units still hesitated at checkpoints, unwilling to believe the deception was over. The idea that the enemy could walk among them had left a deep scar. Among those captured were several teams from Panzer Brigade 150, under international law. Wearing the enemy's uniform while engaged in combat made them spies, not soldiers. Many were tried by field courts and executed by firing squads. The Allies justified the punishment as necessary deterrence and enforcement of the rules that separated warfare from chaos. Yet, even among those who witnessed the executions, there was an unease. The captured men were soldiers, obeying orders, caught in a war that had blurred every boundary. Otto Skorzeny himself, the architect of the operation, managed to return to Germany before the offensive collapsed. In the months that followed, as the Reich disintegrated under Allied bombardment, his name became both feared and mythologized. When the war ended, he was captured and brought to trial at Nuremberg, accused of violating the laws of war for ordering his men to wear enemy uniforms. The case drew international attention. The court proceedings in 1947 revealed a complex truth. Witnesses from all sides testified that soldiers had long used enemy clothing for protection or deception, provided they removed it before fighting. Skorzeny's defense argued that his commandos used the uniforms only for infiltration, not for direct combat. In a surprising decision, the tribunal acquitted him, establishing a precedent that the use of enemy attire in limited tactical deception did not automatically constitute a war crime. It was a legal gray area born from the grayest war. Yet beyond legality, the moral impact remained unresolved. The soldiers who fought in the Ardennes carried with them a memory of mistrust that would last for years. Veterans later spoke of how, after the offensive, the sight of an unfamiliar face in a familiar uniform stirred a reflex of suspicion. It had changed something fundamental, the assumption that a uniform represented identity. Historians later described Operation Greif as a failure in military terms, but a success in psychological warfare. Though the Commandos caused limited physical damage, their existence disrupted entire chains of command. They had demonstrated that confusion could paralyze an army more effectively than firepower. For a brief moment, they turned the battlefield into a place where appearance itself became an enemy. When the Allies pushed into Germany in the spring of 1945, the war of deception ended quietly. Many of the surviving commandos blended back into civilian life, their actions forgotten amid greater crimes and greater tragedies. The documents that describe the operation were stored away in archives, classified for decades. Only years later did historians reconstruct the full picture, the rushed training, the improvised equipment, and the bizarre reality of soldiers pretending to be their enemies. In post-war interviews, some of the participants spoke without pride. They saw themselves not as heroes or villains, but as instruments of desperation. They had obeyed orders in a collapsing war, trapped between loyalty and conscience. One of them recalled that wearing the enemy's uniform made him feel invisible, as if we no longer belonged to either side. It was a fitting description for an operation that had blurred the moral landscape of war. The Allies, too, drew lessons from the incident. Military academies studied the psychological consequences of infiltration, emphasizing the importance of trust, verification, and identification. It changed how armies viewed security and espionage, influencing counterintelligence doctrine during the Cold War. Operation Greif became a case study not in success, but in how easily deception could erode the foundations of discipline and belief. In the decades that followed, the Ardennes remained a place of memory. The villages rebuilt, the forests regrew, and the snow covered the scars of 1944. Yet the story of the German commandos, who wore American uniforms, lingered not as legend, but as warning. It reminded the world that warfare was not only a contest of weapons, but also of perception, and that the most dangerous battles are often fought in the mind. Today, historians remember Operation Greif as one of the boldest and strangest operations of World War II. It failed to achieve its objective, but it succeeded in exposing the vulnerability of certainty. It showed that even in an age of total war, the simplest trick, a uniform, a word, a gesture, could shake the confidence of an entire army. When the survivors of both sides looked back on that bitter winter, they agreed on one thing: no one saw it coming. The deception had lasted only days, but its shadow stretched far beyond the battlefield. It became a symbol of how war distorts identity, until even the difference between friend and foe becomes uncertain.